Hello, history nerds and historians. My name is Krystina, and this is Effed Up Cryptozoology. This is where we talk about a cryptid that's super fucked up. So we're doing something kind of crazy for this month. I have been really inconsistent this year. I recognize that. I have had a lot of stuff going on academically as I'm finishing up my master's in literally like 2 weeks. And I had that internship over the summer. And honestly, my mental health has been garbage. So as a thank you for those who have stuck with me, I have a little treat this month. But before I get to that, I do kind of want to just give a little bit of a shout out. I just feel so, I guess, lucky right now because I've had a few of you reach out to me over social media and emails this year, and I have just loved having those conversations with you all. And to top it all off, I got to meet a couple of you in person this year. So I know that some of my newer listeners are people who went on my tour and got my information for this podcast from there. For any of you who don't know, I live in Salem, Massachusetts. I am a historian of witchcraft, and as a historian of witchcraft, I opened my own tour company that basically offers a 2-hour tour of downtown Salem. It is a very historical and detailed tour of the witch trials of 1692. So I know that some of you who are listening now are people who went on my tour and then found this, but I met 2 people this year who actually listened to this podcast and then went on my tour. The first one, I don't remember your name. I don't think I asked it because I was just so shocked that you said that you listened to my podcast, but you had blonde hair. And at the end of my tour where I was telling people about my podcast, you were like, oh my God, yeah, I knew it was you. I listen all the time. And then another one of you I just met recently, D, it was so nice to meet you in person and give you my tour and talk about the podcast and other just life and politics and pretty much everything. I just feel so grateful to have these opportunities to connect with people and have these conversations and give people a hug. And then to top it all off, I just had someone named Tracy join my Patreon, which is my first Patreon member. And it just makes me so grateful and so, I don't know, this podcast just it's been almost 3 years that I've been doing this podcast, and this podcast is honestly one of the most important things that I've done, and it's honestly gotten me through so much. And just to know that there are people out there who listen and support and want to meet me and want to reach out to me on social media, I don't know, it just means so much to me. And I just feel really lucky, and I just love all of you. So anyway, I want to learn more about cryptids. I've really been on a cryptid kick this year for some reason. And I have decided that in honor of the holiday season and as a reward for dealing with my complete unpredictability this year, I will gift you with as many cryptid stories as I can. Merry freaking Cryptmas, friends! So, I'm gonna get that on a t-shirt. So the Oxford English Dictionary defines cryptid as an animal whose existence or survival is disputed or unsubstantiated. So it often is folklore or scary stories. Oftentimes it's stories that involve oh, these teenagers were driving around at night and they saw something super spooky. Sometimes they are corroborated by indigenous stories or have some sort of scientific theory behind it. But if you are someone who just likes to peek at my sources and fact check me, for any of you who don't know, I usually have all of my sources listed in my description, and I will have my sources listed in my description for this, but don't judge me for these sources, because this is not at all academic this month, okay? This is not peer-reviewed scholarly sources. This is Wikipedia and he said, she said, and I'm being totally unreliable and we're just gonna have a good time, okay? I have always loved cryptids. I think it all started when I watched Harry and the Hendersons at like far too young of an age, and I just fell in love with Sasquatch. That was literally like part of my personality. Like a girl who liked Sasquatch. I was that girl in high school, to the point where like I had a friend in high school, Alyssa, who was also a Sasquatch girl, and we used to like draw pictures of Bigfoot and like go like seek out little tidbits about them. And I remember one time I found this like wooden bowl at Target that looked like a foot, and I sent it to her, and to this day, like 15 years later, I still regret not buying that Bigfoot bowl to just have like on a wall in my house for the rest of eternity. And now that I think about it, that's probably also where my obsession with Chewbacca comes from. Then of course there's also the Loch Ness Monster. I'm hoping next year we can afford to go on a trip to celebrate my graduation in 2 weeks, which I am like so fucking ready for. I am so done with school. And Mr. Effed Up History and I both want to go to Scotland, and I am demanding that we go to Loch Ness, like big fucking bucket list for me. When we were in Nova Scotia in October, when I was presenting at that last conference, which means New Scotland, by the way, which I felt like a total idiot for not picking up on until the last day when we walked into like a Scottish store that sold tartans, and it was like, welcome to New Scotland, and I was like, oh yeah, that's what Scotia means. Super smart me. I have a master's in 2 weeks, and I found the one Nessie item in that store, which was a Loch Ness Monster shaped car air freshener, which means I now have a Loch Ness Monster shaped car air freshener. And then of course there's Mothman, who is my boyfriend, and I was Moth Mommy for Halloween. No, I will not elaborate further at this time, and that is all I'm gonna say about that. So I went back and forth on where to start with this series, and I think I need to just start where it all began for me, which was with my sweet baby Sasquatch. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and practice your oh good god, what the fuck faces! So the term Bigfoot describes any unknown hairy hominid in the world. Bigfoot in North America, which is what it's most likely and more likely like associated with, or more often rather associated with, is believed to be nocturnal and mostly solitary, although there are some reports of Bigfoot families. According to most sources, they don't speak. They just have a distinctive call, or sometimes like a scream or a whistle. They are stocky and tall, anywhere from 6 to 9 feet, with a barrel torso, a small pointy head with no forehead or neck, with a heavy brow ridge and shaggy reddish brown hair all over their body. Unlike humans, there isn't a difference between the hair on their head or their body, and the eponymous foot is big. Obviously. So the first news reports that have like this foot as evidence say that it is 16 inches long and 7 inches wide. And there are some stories of Bigfoot kidnapping people, especially young women. The Bigfoot stories are more often associated with North America. Like I said, one source I read said specifically the Pacific Northwest, but when I was in Albuquerque, I bought quite a few Sasquatch related items and was told that there were Sasquatch stories in the mountains. And when I was in Maine, coming back from Canada, I bought the cutest freaking Sasquatch stuffed animal at like a gas station convenience store. And there is a Florida Bigfoot that I will talk about, and also like an Ohio Bigfoot. Like there's Bigfoot all over the country, big feet all over the country, and even like up into Canada there's a lot of like Bigfoot related stories as well. There are also countless indigenous stories about creatures that are described like the Bigfoot. The Bigfoot can be found like all around the world. The North American Bigfoot, or Sasquatch, is a like continent-wide phenomenon. Although there are some biologists or cryptozoologists that state that Bigfoot are real and are actually just like creatures or species that were thought to have been extinct. So there are some people like Grover Krantz, who was an anthropologist from Washington State University, who said that they are the species Gigantopithecus blacki. Loren Coleman, who was an anthropologist and zoologist, and Patrick Hugh, who was a science writer, say that it is a different species called Paranthropus robustus, or maybe it's a species that has yet to be discovered, like science writer Gordon Strasenberg, who calls it Paranthropus elderelli. But for all intents and purposes, let's just call it Sasquatch or Bigfoot and talk a little bit about how those names came about. There are actually like quite an interesting etymologies behind the terms Bigfoot and Sasquatch. So according to Sasquatch researcher John Green, which I never knew I wanted to be anything more in my life, and biologist Ivan T. Sanderson, who are really big in the research and study of these cryptids, Sasquatch is actually the Canadian word for this large ape-like hairy hominid. It has its origins in indigenous folklore. From what I read, a teacher named J.W. Burns interviewed a bunch of different Canadian indigenous people in the 1920s and took some of the different names that different indigenous groups had for these hairy giants and then coined the term Sasquatch. So some of the sources I found that were written by indigenous people basically say that there is such a fascination with Bigfoot that like any creature from indigenous folklore or mythology that is even slightly Bigfoot-like is a Bigfoot, which just is not the case. The thing about indigenous stories is that a lot of times they're oral and not much is actually like written about them. Here is a pretty long list though of some that I found. So I'm going to say the name that this creature is called by these indigenous groups, the main indigenous group that I saw associated with it, although there are sometimes like multiple tribes that will have the same name for the same like Bigfoot type creature, and then the modern name of the area where these groups are found. I'm going to say, for my American listeners and also my Canadian listeners, we live on colonized land, and these are the colonized names for the land that we live on. And I would just like to take a moment to give a land acknowledgement that these lands do belong to the indigenous people. The land that I am standing on in Salem, Massachusetts, belonged to the Namkeg people. So I'm also going to say as well, like, I am not someone who is good at pronouncing English words. So don't judge me for how I pronounce these words. I'm doing my best. Okay. So there is the Bawis of the Tsimshian people in the Pacific Northwest. There's the Box from the Bella Coola people in what is now central British Columbia. The Chie-Tonka of the Sioux people of what is now the Western United States. The Chaunito of the Wenatchee people in what is now Washington State. The Harriman of the Yokuts people. The Kohenije of the Maidu people, the Matakagmi of the Modoc people, and the Oma of the Hupa people, all from what is now Northern California. The Larian from the Dogrib people in what is now Northwest Canada. The Lofa of the Chickasaw people of what is now the Southeast United States around Northern Mississippi. The Maximista of the Cheyenne people of what is now Montana. The Nain of the Gwich'in people in what is now Northern Canada and Alaska. The Nakani of the Dene people of what is now Northern Canada. The Nat'ina of the Tanaina people of what is now Southern Alaska. The Nick-in-La'ina of the Koyukon people of what is now Alaska. The Shampi of the Choctaw people of what is now Alabama and Mississippi, who were forcefully moved to Oklahoma in the 1830s in a forced migration and relocation that is often referred to historically as the Trail of Tears. So you sometimes will find the Shampi mythology up in Oklahoma as well. The Siatko of the Chehalis people of what is now Washington State, the Skookum of the Chinook people of the Pacific Northwest, the Stiyihama of the Yakima people of what is now Washington State, the Woodsmen of the Athabascan people of what is now Alaska, the Sulkalu of the Cherokee people in what is now North Carolina, the Yahoo of the Shawnee people of what is now Kentucky, the Stonemen of the Iroquois people of what is now New York and Pennsylvania, and there are honestly a ton more. As I was looking through some of these websites, I did find a book that is about 150 pages that breaks all of these down, called Bigfoot/Sasquatch Resurgence of Native American Indian Legends by Leon Pfaller. That is actually available on Kindle Unlimited, and there are a bunch of other books on this topic as well. If you're interested in learning more about this topic from an indigenous lens, which I always kind of recommend doing because it's always kind of good to know where things come from. But I have to say, the indigenous story that I saw mentioned the most was probably the Oma from the Hoopa people. That's probably because in 1994, there was a documentary made by A&E called Fittingly Bigfoot, where Jimmy Jackson, who was a Hoopa elder, was interviewed and told the story of what he called the boss of the mountain, or just the boss. He said that this is what his grandmother called this reclusive creature that lived in the mountains. The Hoopa people had moved more towards the Klamath Mountains when the first colonizers came to Northern California to kind of avoid the settlers. But at one point, some of the Hoopa people went back to take their land back, and one person said it was because the Oma told them to. One Hoopa elder who was interviewed in the 1950s described the Oma as big, maybe 7-8 feet tall, big chest, big arms, big feet, all covered with hair, not fur, smelled really bad, dark face, big teeth, whistled, howled, high-pitched howls. In 2008, a book called The Hoopa Project, Bigfoot Encounters in California, was published by David Paulides that includes eyewitness encounters and descriptions by the Hoopa people, as well as advice to not turn your back on the Oma, but to talk softly if you encounter one and back away slowly. So the interesting thing, and probably why I kept seeing the Oma popping up so much in doing my research on the Sasquatch, is because this is the same area and probably the same creature that created the tracks that a man named Jerry Crew walked into the Humboldt Times office with in 1958 that led to the creation of the name that we all know these creatures by now, Bigfoot. So, Jerry Crews walks into a newspaper office holding a plaster cast of this big footprint. He said that he had found these tracks in the mud in Bluff Creek Valley, which I think is a funny place to find it, Bluff, whatever, you got it, you're smart people. Bluff Creek actually exists. It's in the Six Rivers National Forest. I just think it's funny that that's where it was found. Anyway, so he comes in with this giant plaster cast that is as long as his upper torso. And on October 5th, 1958, the first article is published on it. I couldn't find the original article because it's all behind paywalls, but I did find the October 7th article reprint in the Daily Sun titled Huge Human-Like Footprints Puzzle Lumbermen in North. And it's actually a really interesting article, so I'm going to read it to you. Mr. Bigfoot, abroad in the tall timber of the Klamath River, 50 miles northeast of Eureka, is leaving huge, human-like footprints along a 30-mile stretch of Bluff Creek. Loggers and hunters have been reporting the big footprints for several weeks. Saturday, a bulldozer operator named Jerry Crews, who works for the Granite Lumber Company, came to town with a plaster cast of one. It measures 16 inches long and 7 inches wide. It had 5 stubby toes, and Crews said the creature's weight sank the print 2 inches into the soil, where his own foot left half an inch impression. Crew is a medium-sized man who bulldozes logging trails through virgin timber for a living. He said he never heard of the abominable snowman of the Himalayas. He isn't peddling a barefoot Paul Bunyan. I don't know what this thing is, he says. Nobody does. He adds that a Reading taxidermist, Robert Titmus, has seen the tracks too and says they were not made by any animal that he's ever heard of. It can't be a bear, says Crew. No claw marks. He says he followed one trail for 3/4 of a mile. Titmus measured the stride, found it averaged 50 inches at a walk, and lengthened up to 10 feet when the creature apparently was chasing a deer. Bigfoot, as the Bluff Creek people call the creature, apparently has never been seen, but Crew says he's seen hundreds of the tracks, and several other sources have been reporting them from time to time. Crew says Bigfoot apparently is curious about machinery, prowling around it at night, leaving his tracks in the fresh earth the bulldozers turn up. He's never harmed anyone, but 2 years ago something visited a logging camp one night and flung all 50-gallon oil drums about like firewood. Crew says he and the other loggers sometimes have a feeling that they are being watched. He says he's going to try to rig a camera with an electric trigger and flashlight along a freshly bulldozed trail to try to catch the creature on film. So, interesting story that doesn't honestly really give us much proof, but after this article is published, one reporter named Betty Allen went to some of the indigenous people who were from the area, including the Hoopa, to ask them if they knew anything more about the Bigfoot, and one of the Hoopa people that she interviewed said, quote, "Good Lord, have the white men finally got around to that?" But Jerry Crew wasn't the only person who came forward around this time with a Bigfoot story. In 1957, Albert Ostman from British Columbia started talking about an event that had happened over 30 years prior. He said that in 1924, he was at Toba Inlet by Vancouver Island on a prospecting trip. He'd gone to sleep in the woods when he was scooped up and taken many miles away. He was then dumped out of his sleeping bag, and he was greeted by giant ape-like creatures, a male and a female adult, and 2 juveniles. He said that they were friendly and didn't want him to leave. He shared his tobacco with them, which is what led to his escape 6 days later when Daddy Bigfoot choked on it. No, I don't mean Daddy Bigfoot like that, you monster fuckers. So he was interviewed separately by John Green and Ivan T. Sanderson, as well as an anthropologist from the Smithsonian named John Napier, and they all said that they don't believe that he was lying and said that he was totally sane. So following these encounters that came forward, Ivan T. Sanderson wrote a series of articles about what he termed California's abominable snowman. Although I read a couple articles where people really wanted to emphasize the abominable snowman or the Yeti is more often described as an ape, where the Sasquatch is more often described as humanoid. I couldn't find the articles that Sanderson wrote. I searched and searched for them. The only thing that looked promising was behind a paywall through a university. But I did find the book that he wrote in 1961 because so many people were interested in what he had to say. Because here's the thing, Ivan T. Sanderson wasn't just like some backwoods dude who drank too much moonshine and thought that he saw something in the middle of the night. He was a biologist who went to Cambridge University in England and had a degree in zoology. So the book that he wrote is called Abominable Snowmen, Legend Comes to Life. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Oma, Grassman, and Skunk Ape. The story of subhumans on 5 continents from the early Ice Age until today, or at least 1961 when it was published. My Kindle copy that I purchased is 522 pages, so needless to say, I have not read it yet, but I will. I also found an illustrated copy that I feel like I need. And may purchase to like show off to people, like my copy of Satan Was a Lesbian, which is like a pulp fiction novel from the 1960s that I searched for months after watching the Strange Eons video about it, and now I have acquired it and it sits staring at people from my bookshelf. So after the article and these books were written, people were on the hunt to find the Sasquatch, including Roger Patterson, who was a rodeo rider and filmer of the famous Patterson film on October 20th, 1967. This is also called sometimes the Patterson-Gimlin film because Bob Giblin was with him and may have helped him film it. I am positive that you have seen this. It is the one where a supposedly female Sasquatch is walking along the water, making direct eye contact with the camera and stomping off. Coincidentally, this was filmed pretty close to where Jerry Crew said that he found the first prints and where the Hoopa people report the Oma. So Patterson died a couple years after this video was taken, but swore up and down that he was telling the truth. Bob Titmus, who was Jerry Crew's friend and the man who made those first like plaster casts, he became like the guy to go to for Bigfoot prints, and he corroborated Patterson and said he found corresponding prints in the same area following the same path. There are some people, though, who say that this video was a hoax. So in 2005, a guy named Bob Hieronymus, who was a rodeo rider with Patterson, said that it was him in the suit. He said Roger Patterson had approached him, offered him $1,000 for 10 minutes of his time. They met a couple weeks later in Bluff Creek, put on the suit, did his little walk, the whole time being terrified that a hunter was going to shoot him because it was October, which is hunting season. And Patterson filmed it, and that's it. Hieronymus said that it wasn't really a secret back home, and he didn't feel the need to keep it a secret because he was never even paid the $1,000 that he was promised. Who knows if this is true? I will say the documentary did film him walking, and the walk did look pretty similar. I'm gonna say. I mean, who knows? Like if he put on a show to make it look similar, but like it looked pretty similar. obviously wasn't there, so I don't have an opinion on it. But there's never been a body or anything substantial found outside of tracks and what is believed to be hair and fecal samples. But like I said, there are stories from all over North America about Bigfoot. So one of the other big ones that I kept seeing was the Ohio grassman, obviously from Ohio. It's also sometimes called the Kenmore grassman or just orange eyes. This is apparently a more aggressive breed of big feet. It's named grassman because it builds grass huts or large nests. So the first time it was reported was in August of 1978 in Minerva, Ohio. Evelyn and Hal Clayton were watching their grandchildren when they ran inside screaming about a hairy monster that they saw outside. So the two grandparents went out to investigate it and found a large creature in a pit near their house with matted fur rifling through the trash. They saw this creature a couple more times over the next few months. It stared at them through their windows, glared at them from a nearby hill, and then a couple weeks later they saw two on the hill, and during this time their dog was killed, and they think that it was by one of these creatures. The article I read recognizes indigenous stories about these kinds of creatures in Ohio, but doesn't specify which creatures. So I looked through one of my sources and found 3 different stories from Ohio, but the one that sounded the most similar was the Yahoo or the Yeehaw, which are named mostly for the sound that they make. These stories come from the Shawnee people from what is now Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, and occasionally in the Appalachian Mountains. They were just very migratory people in what is now America. The stories that they told about their version of the Bigfoot was both an aggressive and compassionate creature. There was a story from the Shawnee people about this man who was camping out and took shelter in a cave. And after a couple days, a female Yahoo came in to see him. And pretty soon after that, she had a kid that was a little less hairy than its mother. And when the man eventually left her and his child that he made with this Bigfoot creature, she tore the baby in half. There is another story that's very similar to this that goes into a little more detail. A man who took shelter in a cave where he found a store of chestnuts and other food. And then he and the Yahoo woohooed, to put it in Sims terms, and she had a baby soon after. But this story goes on to describe the female a little bit more, that she had nails so long that she could skin a deer with them. She didn't understand fire until she was taught about it by the hunter, where she realizes that she can cook with fire and just goes ham on that. And then the story is really similar, that she gives birth to a baby with less hair than its mother, and then she tears it apart in anger. So I'm going to say this episode has already gone way longer than I thought it would be. I'm at 7 pages of my script, and I thought it would be 2. So don't expect as much detail in all of them going forward, because I don't plan on it. But I do want to talk about one from my home state of Florida, better known as the skunk ape, which actually was a lot closer to me than I thought. So early reports describe a giant ape-like creature in the Florida Everglades. It wasn't bipedal or humanoid. It was like a deformed chimp is what people describe, which honestly, I believe it. The Everglades are where there are all kinds of huge animals hiding there. So I feel like if there's a giant deformed ape in Florida, it's probably going to be in the Everglades. So while there were reports of seeing this creature in the Florida Keys or even in Broward County, which was where my grandparents lived, and I spent many a summer and Thanksgiving there, it was more so found in western central Florida, which is where I grew up. But in the 1970s, stories started coming forward about a 7-foot-tall, 300-pound bipedal creature with dark brown, red, or black fur that stunk. They smelled like a mixture of skunk, rotten eggs, and cow manure. Honestly, how fitting for Florida. In 1975, 7 young men saw 3 skunk apes in Citrus County, Florida, and in 1977, there were more, including one that was 10 feet tall, which was found in Moon Lake, Florida, which is where I went to camp. Nature camp, specifically. Just imagine, 8-year-old Krystina, if she knew that there was a skunk ape, right around the corner. So the more recent large report of a skunk ape was in 1997 in Okeechobee, which is in southwest Florida in the Everglades and right next to a conservation area. So a group of foreign tourists were riding through Okeechobee when they saw a large ape-like animal by the swamp. Around the same time, the fire chief Vince Doer said that he saw something similar, but was convinced that it was just a prank of a guy that was wearing a suit. He said if he was convinced that it was at all real, he would have hunted it down, beat it to death, and sell it to the National Enquirer. And if that ain't Florida, I don't know what is. But again, it was described as ape-like in South Florida. So maybe there are two different kinds of creatures. The skunk ape of South Florida that is actually some sort of deformed ape. And then the skunk ape of Central Florida that is actually like a Bigfoot type creature. I again went to the indigenous stories and read all about the Sasquatch of the Seminole people who lived in what is now Florida. So the Sasquatch means tall, hairy man. The Seminole people were taught that these creatures were always there and needed to be respected. They described a creature that was intelligent and almost human-like, but very smelly, leading to people who were not indigenous calling them skunk apes. There's only one story that is kind of interesting, and I don't know what to make of it. It says that it used to break large branches from trees where Seminole women who gave birth to stillborn children would bury their babies. And I don't really know what to make of that, but okay. And this is where I was planning on ending this episode. Like in my script, I wrote my conclusion after this, but I found two honorable mentions when I was researching that I just can't not talk about. I didn't want to do like individual episodes for them because there's not like a lot written about them, but these two they're like big feet, but also not big feet. They're similar, but I can't 100% consider it a Bigfoot. So the first we're going to talk about is the sheep squatch, also sometimes called the white thing from West Virginia. It's described as about the size of a bear with white woolly fur. It has a pointed head and saber teeth and a small set of horns on its head, similar to those found on a goat. Its feet are similar to raccoons, but much larger, and their tail is like that of an opossum, long and hairless, and it apparently smells kind of like sulfur. So in the 1990s, it was seen 3 different times in Boone County, West Virginia. The first time it was seen was in 1994 when a former Navy SEAL saw it in the forest, first drinking water from a creek and then kind of just like wandering around. And a couple months later, the same creature was seen by 2 children in Boone County, although they reported it as walking on its hind legs like Bigfoot, or maybe just a bear. The next year, it was seen again by a couple in a car who reported seeing it in a ditch on the side of the road in Boone County. They pulled over onto the shoulder to see it better, and then it jumped out of the ditch and began attacking the car. So they took off as fast as they could, and when people went to investigate the area, they didn't find anything, but large gashes in the car served as evidence for the couple. Everything was kind of quiet for the next few years until 1999 when some campers reported hearing an animal sniffing around their campsite like a bear. But when they saw what it was the sheep squatch, and it chased them down. They exit stage left, pursued by a sheep squatch. When they came back the next morning, they said that it looked like someone had tilled the soil. And it was all quiet on the sheep squatch hunt until 6 campers of unknown identity were in Folks Run, Virginia in 2015 and saw a white creature on a hill. They sat there watching them for a few moments before it rose up on its hind legs, reaching 9 feet tall. It then ran down the hill, crossed the water, and tried to attack them when it heard a loud, gut-based screech from about 2 miles away. The sheep squatch apparently then froze, whimpered, and ran off in the opposite direction of the noise. So the Cherokee people from the area have a creature in their mythology that is a large white dog creature that I saw some articles referencing, but it doesn't sound the same. In my opinion, I think the one in the 90s sounds to me like a bear with some kind of deformity, or maybe it was like albino or something like that. The one in 2015, I don't have a story for it, but I do want to also say I don't fully believe it. Now, the other honorable mention is the bat squatch. It's April 1994 in Washington State, and an 18-year-old named Brian Canfield was driving around the base of Mount Rainier when his truck broke down. Before he even stepped foot out of the car, a giant thing landed in front of him. This thing had broad shoulders, yellow eyes, a mouthful of sharp teeth, and tufted ears. It had clawed feet, a wolf-like face, and was covered in what he said looked like blue fur. It was 9 feet tall and had wings as wide as the 2-laned road. They stared at each other for a moment before this creature beat its giant wings so hard that it shook his car, and then it took off. As soon as the beast left, the car could work again, and he raced home. He told his parents about this creature that he called the Sasquatch, their parents armed themselves and raced back to the spot, but they didn't find anything. But the story was picked up, and honestly, like, the rest is history. There was another sighting in that area in 2011 of something that was called the Sasquatch, but it was described smaller and gray with smooth skin. But sightings of the Sasquatch have occurred all over the country. Sasquatch apparently flew from Washington State to California, Texas, Missouri, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Wisconsin, but nothing concrete has been found. Whole mythology was created around it based on that first and potentially only, like, quote unquote real sighting, that the creature lived in Mount St. Helens, but when it erupted, it relocated to Mount Rainier. Apparently, there are some stories as well that the eruption killed off most of the Bigfoot big feet. And on that, I think that is where we're going to end today. So thank you so much for listening. If you like what you heard and want to hear more, please consider supporting this podcast by subscribing or leaving a review or joining my Patreon. And remember, friends, history may be watching you, so don't fuck it up. And be careful of the woods. Bye!